Hey everybody, today I'm going to talk about Stuck in the Present, which was written by David George Moore and published by Leafwood. Quick disclaimer before I jump in. David actually found my YouTube channel and he reached out to me personally because based on some of what I've talked about here, he thought I might have some interest in his book, which he's the writer of this. And so I agree, after looking at it, I agreed that I thought I would be interested. So he sent me a copy for review. This is my honest reaction to the book, but I did want to say thank you to David if you're watching for sending me this for review. So let's jump in through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then just my general reactions to it. This one is not very long. It's a popular level book, so I don't think this is going to be a super long review. But the main idea of this is, David is a historian, primarily, is his area of work and expertise. And the subtitle is How History Frees and Forms Christians. So it's ostensibly about the Christian's attitude towards history, towards what has passed, and how a more responsible attitude towards it. Generally, his argument kind of presupposes that a lot of, at least I take it, a lot of popular Protestant evangelical type Christians do not have a super responsible attitude towards history. And maybe more broadly, our cultural moment in general doesn't, Christian or not. But he's really speaking to Christians and trying to encourage a more humble, responsible, thoughtful attitude towards what has gone before us and the bearing it may have on us now in this moment. The reason I say it's ostensibly about history is because as I read through this, I thought I resonated a lot with his arguments. But I would argue this is more than just being about history. It's more just about general intellectual formation as a person of faith. It's a lot about humility in our intellect. It's a lot about reading widely, including historically widely. And it's a lot about not jumping to conclusions about opposing views, but actually listening. It's a lot about receiving opposing views, even if we don't agree at the outset. So it's a lot about, even though it's through the lens of history, because that's his primary area of reading and expertise, I think it has a much broader application to just how do we think and how do we learn and how do we be humble and responsible in thinking and learning and being formed. So that's what the book is about. It's a pretty kind of wide-ranging, in a popular short format, exploration of all of those things, primarily in 4 chapters. And it really, obviously he's going to encourage a much more of a robust kind of reading program in historical research and historical study. So that's what Stuck in the Present is about, kind of about how history, a responsible attitude towards history, but more broadly, I would say it's more sneakily, it's about how do we be formed, how does our intellect get formed more responsibly as Christian people of faith. So now, that being said, the research behind it, one thing I actually like when popular level books do this, each chapter has its own cited bibliography right at the end of the chapter, so you can immediately see what formed the arguments in that particular chapter. I prefer footnotes to endnotes, but if you're going to do a popular level book, you don't really do footnotes, so I like this way. Anyways, that may seem like a really minor quibble, but for me, as someone who pays attention to citations, I actually really like that. I appreciate that production kind of nuance. Okay, but more importantly, so David is a really well-read person, and for the popular level style of this book, which I'll get to in a second, for how popularly it's written, kind of at its approachability, there is a much higher ratio of citations and sources to pages than you would expect in another popular level book, which I really liked. He interacts with, and it's also broad, it's not just historians, although he does interact with Nathan Hatchin and Mark Knoll in particular. Scandal of the Evangelical Mind thesis plays a role in what he talks about. He also interacts with Augustine and Calvin, some more of the historical Christian thinkers. He also talks about cultural studies. He interacts with kind of current events. He references blogs and writings like Scott McKnight. So it's a fairly broad range, I would say, of reading, but it's a popular level book. And I think that he interacts really well with that broad range of thinking in each argument, in each chapter, which kind of has its own thrust and its own theme. So not a lot to say on the research there. It's really solid. I mean, he seems like a responsible researcher, a responsible academic in that way. The readability of this, now the readability is extraordinarily high. I think I read, if not the whole thing, I read almost the whole thing in a day, in a couple hours. It's incredibly inviting. It's incredibly warm and pastoral and thoughtful. The reason I highlight that is because I think this is one of the, sometimes when I read or review books like this, I recommend them for group study. I don't recommend every book for group study by any means, but this is one that I would. definitely recommend for small groups or group study. If you're in a church or maybe a school or a private school, something that Christian school, I could see doing a small group study through this when you're thinking about not just history full stop, but like our approach to history and our approach to the life of the mind, the intellect. I think this would be a really, really, really good fit for that. I think even high schoolers like at that level could get into it, maybe on the upper level high schoolers. So super readable, very, very, very goes down very smooth. And then my reaction to it as a whole. So my feelings for this book are positive. I will say, this is not something because of its kind of intro level tone or posture. It's not necessarily something I would have sought out on my own kind of exploration of titles to read. It's not necessarily something I would have grabbed, because I love history and I've done a good bit of study in some of the thinkers that he cites here, and I think this is a little bit more intro level than what I would typically read. So I just want to give that as a caveat. If you're a reader like me, take that for what it's worth. However, I just liked the tone. I liked the tone. I liked the posture he takes. I agree a lot with his ideas. In chapter 4 is his maxims for learning, and a lot of it can boil down to healthy humility. He talks a lot about humility, being humble in your own estimations of your own viewpoints, being aware of your own sinfulness and how it can cloud your own thinking, for example, thinking about approaching others with that humble attitude and steel-manning their views as opposed to straw-manning their views. Those are he walks through those maxims. It's very reasoned, very sensible, very encouraging. And I agreed and loved all of that. And so I'm very much simpatico with him and his approach here. And I also really agree with his kind of general thrust that like we need to improve the intellectual formation of kind of evangelical Christianity. And so I'm just like in lockstep with him in a lot of his kind of core parts of his thesis here. And the last thing I want to say before I end this review is I really liked those four chapters. I thought they were solid. They were intro, maybe more intro level than something I would typically read. But I really liked the inclusion at the end of 3 interviews he did with historians. He did an interview with Robert Tracy McKenzie, who I've read a couple of his books and really liked his work. Also, Jamar Tisby, who's someone else I really like. He interviewed him. And then James McPherson, who's actually someone I'm not familiar with, but now I really want to read his work on the Civil War, especially. Those interviews, to be honest, I like those interviews as much as I think the majority of the book, those first 4 chapters, because he models a really strong intellectual and humble engagement with those historians in those interviews and the back and forth they have. And if you like for example, I really have appreciated both Tracy McKenzie and Jamar Tisby's work that I've read. Those interviews give a little bit of an interesting light back on the work that I've already read by them. And I was surprised by those, and I really thought those were valuable. So that's just something that I wanted to highlight about the book that I wasn't necessarily aware of even when I agreed to review it. So just to tie this all together, I think Stuck in the Present, super inviting, super thoughtful, super gracious, very humble, intro-level book. Even though it's not necessarily something I would have sought out, I'm happy to commend it for those particular kind of settings I talked about. Like if you're someone who hasn't done a lot of reading in history, or if you're looking for a small group that is interested in history or just intellectual formation, this would be a really good go-to resource for you in that regard. And I'm happy to commend it to you for those reasons. So again, thank you to David for sending me a copy for review. Thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.